Declassified. Baston, 1944. A corporal in a frozen foxhole hears a secret. Through a captured German radio, a panzer commander gives coordinates, not to his tanks, to American positions. 300 GIS are sleeping 2 minutes away, right in the kill zone. Eddie Voss has 1 second to make an impossible choice. Obey his direct orders and let 300 men be annihilated or commit a court-martial offense and become the enemy. Eddie keys the mic and speaks perfect unauthorized German into the void. This is the forbidden story of the one radio call that saved a battalion and why the United States Army tried to bury the truth forever. Before we dive in, if you believe the most important wartime stories are the ones that were never supposed to be told, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You will not find these stories anywhere else. To understand how Eddie Voss could hold 300 lives in his hand, you first have to understand the chaos of December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't a battle. It was a shattering Hitler's last desperate gamble. He had thrown 250,000 men and over 1,000 armored vehicles into the Ardennes forest, a sector the Allies believed was quiet. The American lines didn't bend, they snapped. Entire divisions were encircled, regiments were cut off, their command structures vaporized. And in this frozen hell, the single most critical asset wasn't bullets or food or even warmth. It was communication. And communication was dead. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was in a state of panic. Radio operators meant to relay simple messages. Up the chain were suddenly isolated. Their equipment was failing in the sub-zero temperatures. Batteries died in hours, not days. And the airwaves were a screaming cacophony of jammed frequencies, desperate calls for help, and German. The Germans were advancing so fast, their communications were better than the defenders. Their panzers, their infantry, their artillery. They were all talking, they were coordinating. And the Americans were deaf. This is where Corporal Eddie Voss comes in. Eddie Voss wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't supposed to be listening at all. He was the son of German immigrants who had fled Europe in 1923, settling in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Until Pearl Harbor, German was the language of his home. He learned it at his grandmother's knee. But he didn't just learn the words, he learned the rhythms. He learned the subtle difference between a Prussian dialect and a Bavarian one. He learned the idioms, the slang, the music of the language. But Eddie had another stranger gift, a gift for patterns. Before the war, he worked for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. His job was troubleshooting. When electrical systems failed, Eddie wouldn't just look at the schematics. He would listen. He would listen to the hum of the transformers. He'd put his ear to a circuit breaker. He told his superiors that equipment had personalities. He could hear a slight change in a transformer's rhythm days before it failed. He could diagnose a fault by the personality of the static it made. His bosses thought he was eccentric, but he was never wrong. When he enlisted in 1943, the Army tested his German. They marked him fluent and assigned him to signals intelligence. But this wasn't a spy movie. There was no cozy desk job in London translating intercepts through some bureaucratic mix-up. Some officer looking at the wrong line on a spreadsheet. Eddie was assigned to the 101st Airborne as a field radio operator. His gift was ignored. His job was to fix equipment, relay coordinates, and maintain communication lines. He spent most of 1944 cold, wet, and bored until the Bulge. When Hitler's offensive shattered the lines, Eddie found himself in that frozen foxhole outside Bastonia. His unit was cut off. His orders were simple. Stay alive and keep the radio warm. He had his standard issue SCR 300 radio, and he had a pair of high-quality headphones scavenged from a destroyed German STKS 251 half-track, and he had nothing but time. So he did what he had always done. He started listening. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had strict protocols. Rule number 1. Operators were forbidden from monitoring enemy frequencies. Forbidden. The reasons were practical. First, it wasted time. Second, it risked operators being fed disinformation. And third, it could lead to unauthorized responses that compromised operational security. Eddie Voss heard those rules, and he broke them. He spun the dial. He moved past the American static, past the silence, and into the German spectrum. At first, it was just curiosity, fragments of chatter requesting ammunition. Sector 4B. Adjust fire 200 meter north. Move the column. Move the column. Just voices in the dark. Men speaking his Ruah, grandmother's language, while trying to kill his friends. But then Eddie's real gift kicked in. The gift from the power company. He wasn't just hearing voices, he was hearing patterns. He grabbed a notebook and a pencil. He sketched crude maps based on unit designations. He logged transmission times, frequencies, call signs, and just like the transformers in Milwaukee, he started hearing personalities. There was an artillery spotter who pronounced fire with a slight, almost imperceptible lisp. There was a logistics officer who ended every transmission with end in the same board monotone. And there was a panzer commander. Eddie's pencil hovered over the page. This one was different. His call sign was Eisenfußwehr, Iron Fist 4. The voice was a low rasp, a smoker's voice. The man was cautious, methodical. Eddie kept listening to Iron Fist 4 for 1 day, then 2. He barely slept. He just listened and he wrote. Within 48 hours, Eddie knew this man. He knew this commander was operating northeast of Bastonia. He knew his fuel situation was critical, and he knew why the commander was so cautious. On the second night, Eddie heard a furious exchange. It was Iron Fist 4, the man Eddie had started to call Klaus in his notes. Klauser was arguing with his own command. He wasn't insubordinate. He was professional, but he was furious. Klauser was refusing to move his column down a new route until it was cleared by engineers. He kept repeating, 2 tanks lost. Not again. Eddie's blood ran cold. Klauser wasn't just cautious. He was traumatized. He had lost 2 tanks, 2 full crews to American minefields in the past week. He had driven his men into a trap based on bad intelligence, and he was never going to let it happen again. This is a critical moment. Eddie realized something about German radio discipline. The Wehrmacht's communication doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, terrifyingly efficient. Normally. But this wasn't normal. This was the bulge. The Germans were exhausted. Their equipment was failing. And in their desperation to keep moving, they had started cutting corners. They weren't using proper code sequences to authenticate transmissions. There wasn't time. Instead, they relied on recognition, on familiarity, on knowing their officers' voices, on the familiar cadence of orders. It was faster. It was practical. And as Eddie Voss sat in his foxhole, he realized it was a catastrophic vulnerability. Klauser, the man who had lost 2 tanks, the man who was terrified of mines, would question orders from an unfamiliar voice. He would demand confirmation. But what if an order came through that sounded exactly like his superiors? What if that order confirmed his deepest fears? What if it promised him safety from the very thing he dreaded most? Eddie understood something about psychology that the army didn't teach. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything. They are suspicious of anomalies, things that don't fit the pattern. But if you match the pattern perfectly, if you sound exactly like what they expect to hear, suspicion never triggers. The brain simply accepts the familiar and moves on. Eddie Voss now knew how to talk to Klauser. He knew his call sign. He knew his frequency. He knew his fear. He was holding a psychological key. The ethical weight of what he was considering was crushing. This wasn't war. This was impersonation. He wouldn't just be breaking army regulations. He'd be engaging in psychological warfare alone, without authorization. If he was caught, if the Germans detected the deception and triangulated his position, they would rain artillery on his foxhole until there was nothing left but a smoking crater. But worse than that, he'd be deceiving a man he'd come to understand, maybe even respect. Clauser was the enemy. Klaus would kill Americans. But Clauser was also a human being, a professional soldier, traumatized by loss, just trying to do his job and keep his men alive. And Eddie was now planning to weaponize that man's trauma to send him and his entire battalion to their deaths. Eddie stared at his notes as the snow fell thicker, muffling the world. The moral calculation was simple, and it was horrible. Clauser and his 40 tanks versus 300 sleeping American infantrymen. There was no good choice. There was only the choice that saved the most lives on his side. He started running scenarios in his head. How would he get the right accent? His grandmother's German was working ass. Klaus's commanders. They sounded different. Aristocratic, Prussian, clipped consonants. Absolute certainty. He began whispering into the frozen air, practicing. Eisen foe fear here. Oba Commando. No, that wasn't right. The pitch was wrong. Eisenfu fear here. Panzergop Commando closer. Had to become a Prussian general. He was so deep in his planning, so lost in the static. So used that he didn't hear the boots crunching in the snow behind him. Corporal. Eddie's head snapped up. The man standing at the edge of his foxhole wasn't from his unit. He was an officer flanked by 2 armed MPs. Snow gathered on his shoulders. He held out his hand. "Give me the headset, Corporal." It was Captain Morrison. Eddie's stomach dropped. He pulled the headphones off slowly, the German voices still crackling faintly. Sir, I can explain. You've been monitoring enemy frequencies without authorization for 4 days." Morrison's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that comes before an explosion. "You filled notebooks with intelligence you have no clearance to collect, and you've been using a captured enemy radio set without reporting it to command." One of the MPs climbed down into the foxhole. He didn't speak. He just began disconnecting Eddie's equipment. The SCR-300 went first, then the captured German headphones, and then the MP reached for the notebook. "No, sir, please." Eddie watched his work, his patterns, his maps, Clauser, disappear into an equipment bag. It felt like they were dismantling his brain. "Sir, you don't understand. There's a panzer column called Icenia." "I understand perfectly, Corporal." Morrison cut him off, his voice like ice. "You're a radio operator. You are not an intelligence analyst. We have trained personnel for this, but they're moving tonight on the fuel depot west of here. There are 300 men sleeping there." "Enough." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how many false reports intelligence gets every day? Every private who speaks a little high school German thinks he's cracked the Enigma code from a damn foxhole." "This isn't false, sir. I've been tracking him for days. I know his voice. I know his fears." "You've been listening to radio chatter you are not trained to interpret," Morrison said, gesturing to the MP who was now collecting the captured German radio. "For all you know, Corporal, you've been listening to a deception operation. The Germans know we monitor their frequencies. They feed us disinformation constantly." Eddie felt something breaking inside him. Not anger, something colder. The realization that Morrison wasn't listening. He wasn't going to check. He wasn't going to do anything except follow protocol. "Sir, please just verify it. Send a runner to the depot. Tell them to expect contact. That's all I'm asking." Morrison studied Eddie for a long, terrible moment. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle, which was worse. "Voss, you're a good radio operator. You've kept our comms running under impossible conditions, but you crossed a line, a serious line. You will cease all monitoring of enemy frequencies, immediately. You will not discuss your unauthorized intelligence with anyone. And if I hear you've so much as touched enemy equipment again, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." The words tasted like ash. "Good." Morrison stood up. "Get some sleep. You look like hell." The captain turned and climbed out of the foxhole. The MPs followed, carrying Eddie's entire world in their bags. Eddie sat in the sudden, agonizing silence. The German radio was gone. His clear throat notes were gone. His ability to monitor Klauser was gone. And somewhere out in the darkness, 40 German tanks were fueling up, preparing to roll over 300 sleeping Americans. He tried to tell himself it was over. He tried to believe Morrison would follow up, that the system would work, but he'd been in the army long enough to know better. Morrison would file a report. That report would be added to a stack. Intelligence would prioritize threats based on source reliability, and an unauthorized corporal's warning would rank somewhere below 0. The snow fell harder, turning the world into a gray, hopeless void. He pulled his coat tighter. There had to be a way, some proper channel. And that's when he heard it. Voices drifting from a supply trench 30 yards away. 2 officers walking fast, their voices carrying on the cold night air. Pulled every available man for the defense perimeter. That fuel depot's practically empty now. Smart. If the Germans break through, better to have the men than the diesel, assuming the Germans even know where it is. That sector's been quiet for days. The voices faded. Eddie sat perfectly still. The fuel depot wasn't just undefended. It had been deliberately stripped of its men. Command Clear's throat had gambled. They had bet 300 lives that the Germans didn't know its location. But Klauser knew Eddie had heard the orders himself, and in approximately 4 hours, Klauser would receive his final orders, and 40 Panzer tanks would turn west. He looked at the corner of his foxhole where the captured German radio had been. It was gone, confiscated, locked away, but not destroyed. Eddie Voss had never stolen anything in his life. He had never disobeyed a direct order. But sitting in that frozen hole, knowing what he knew, he realized his entire life, the German grandmother, the transformers in Milwaukee, the bureaucratic mix-up, it had all been preparing him for this moment. He pulls his helmet on, checks his bayonet, and slowly, quietly, climbs out of his foxhole. He vanishes into the blizzard. The supply depot was a collection of canvas tents and wooden crates arranged in what optimistic planners called organization. But to Eddie, the troubleshooter from Milwaukee, it was just another system, a system with patterns. He moved between the shadows, a ghost in the blizzard. His breath formed small clouds that vanished in the falling snow. He wasn't a commando. He was a radio operator. He was cold. He was terrified. And he was moving on pure cold rage. He knew which paths the sentries walked. He knew which tents held ammunition and which held equipment awaiting intelligence review. The captured German radio would be in the CI tent. Counterintelligence, a glorified storage area where confiscated enemy equipment sat, waiting for someone with the proper clearance to tag it, catalog it, and ship it to London or Washington. The tent was guarded, but not heavily. Who would steal a broken German radio in the middle of a war? Eddie crouched behind a stack of frozen supply crates, his eyes fixed on the guard. A young kid, probably 19, stamping his feet against the cold, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Eddie didn't watch the guard. He watched the pattern. The kid was cold. He was miserable, and he was predictable. He would stand at the tent flap for 30 seconds, then turn and walk 10 paces to his right to the corner of the next tent, just to feel the illusion of movement, of warmth. He'd stay there for 10 seconds, then walk back, a 40-second cycle. 10 seconds of which the tent flap was unwatched. 10 seconds was an eternity. Eddie waited for the turn. The moment the guard's back was to him, he moved. He didn't run. He glided. 3 long steps across the snow. He slipped under the tent flap and was inside. He was in organized chaos. Luger pistols, binoculars, German helmets, stacks of maps, all tagged. And in the corner, just as he'd expected, was the equipment bag the MPs had taken. He grabbed it. It felt heavy. The radio was inside, but his notebook wasn't in the bag. Panic surged in his throat. The radio was useless without the notes. The frequencies, the call signs, the patterns, Klaus's voice. He scanned the tent. It was dark, lit only by a single low-watt bulb on a field desk, and there on the desk, weighted down by a coffee mug, was his notebook. On top of it was a small typed tag. Eddie squinted to read it. Unauthorized intelligence to be forwarded to G2 for review. Source, CPL WWII. They hadn't even dismissed it. They were studying it. He snatched the notebook. He was out of the tent in 2 seconds. The guard was just beginning his turn back toward the flap. He never saw the shadow that slipped back into the blizzard. Back in his foxhole, Eddie's hands shook so violently he could barely reconnect the radio. He was breathing in gasps. He had just committed a dozen court-martial offenses. Theft of evidence, insubordination, breaking confinement to quarters. He didn't care. He checked the radio. The German engineering was solid. It was still functional. He looked at the battery and his heart sank. The power level was low, critically low. He had maybe 2 hours of transmission time, maybe less in the freezing cold. He had one shot at this. If the battery died mid-transmission, if he was cut off, Klauser would know. The Germans would know. They would triangulate the partial broadcast, and this foxhole would become a crater. One shot. Eddie opened his precious notebook, his hands smeared with frozen mud, turned the pages. There it was. Frequency, 43. 4 megahertz, the standard Panzergruppe command channel. Call sign Eisenfu, Fear scheduled check-in. 230 hours his watch, 0:02. 03 hours, he had less than 30 minutes to get on the air. Broadcast his fake orders, have acknowledged them, and get off the air before the real German command tried to call. He was in a race against his own army, and the German won. Now the performance. He couldn't just speak German. He had to become the enemy. He closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. He pictured the voices he'd heard. Not was the target. He had to become Klaus's superior. He remembered the voice from 2 nights ago. The one who gave Klauser the bad intelligence about the minefields. The voice was sharp, aristocratic, a Prussian accent. The man spoke with the absolute bored certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his life. Eddie whispered into the darkness of his foxhole, practicing. Eisenfaust Wehr here. Panzergruppe Commando. He stopped. No, that was his voice. That was Milwaukee German. It was nice. The commander's voice wasn't nice. It was a weapon. It was clipped. The vowels were short. He tried again, pitching his voice lower, forcing the air from his diaphragm. Eisenfaust Wehr here, Commando. Closer. He had to sound bored, annoyed, even as if this was a distraction from more important matters. The way an aristocrat speaks to a mechanic, he practiced the phrases over and over. Noah, new orders. Route is compromat. Route is compromised. So, Fort Furan, execute immediately. He felt the words change his mouth, his throat. He wasn't Eddie Voss, the troubleshooter. He was Oberst Van. Somebody, a man who sent tanks to their death as easily as signing a dinner receipt. Finally, the lie. He couldn't just tell Klauser to stop. That would be suspicious. He had to redirect him. He had to use Klaus's trauma. He looked at his notes at the crude map he had sketched. He remembered radio chatter from 3 days ago, a quiet sector northeast of his position. The Americans had laid a massive anti-tank minefield there, a defensive field, and then pulled back. The Germans hadn't contested the ground because it was useless. It led nowhere. But Clauser didn't know that. Eddie planned the lie. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was diabolical. He wouldn't just tell Clauser to avoid a minefield. He would tell him his current route, the one to the fuel depot, was the minefield, and that he, the all-knowing commander, was saving him by diverting him to a new safe route, a safe route that would send Claus's entire battalion directly into the real, forgotten American minefield. He checked his watch. 16 hours. It was time. His hand was shaking as he reached for the transmitter. This was it. The moral calculation was over. He was about to play God. He was about to sentence a man he respected to a horrific death to save men who would never even know his name. His finger pressed the transmit switch. In the silence of the foxhole, the click of the German mechanism sounded as loud as a gunshot. He waited for the red light to glow. It did. He opened his mouth and became someone else entirely. Eisenia Commando Me Iron Fist 4. This is Tank Group Command. Report in his voice. It wasn't his. It was the Prussians. It was cold, sharp, and full of authority. He released the switch. Silence. Nothing but the faint hiss of static. His heart hammered against his ribs. He waited 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Did he get the frequency wrong? Was the battery already dead? Was Claus not monitoring? Did he hear Eisen, Fear, and Funite? This is Iron Fist 4. Ready to receive the voice, the smoker's rasp. It was him. It was Clauser. Eddie nearly dropped the microphone in relief. He forced himself to wait. He counted 1, 2, 3. A commander doesn't rush. A commander is in control. He pressed the transmit button again. Eisen Failer on Fist. 4 new orders. IA actual angry code is compromat. Your current attack route code Harvest is compromised. He released the button. The response was almost immediate, and it was full of confusion. Compromiat Fian isn't right. Compromised. I do not understand. We are ready. Clauser was questioning. This was the moment, the inflection point. Eddie's entire plan. The lives of 300 men rested on this next sentence. He had to sell the lie. He had to use the key. He pressed the switch. He let impatience and anger flow into his voice. Silence. Listen. Lung. Aerial reconnaissance has identified significant American minefields along your designated route. Sector Hartmann. It is a trap. I repeat, your route is a trap. He released a long, agonizing silence. He could hear Clauser breathing on the other end of the radio. He could feel the man's mind flashing back to his 2 lost tanks, to the fires, to the screams, the trauma Eddie had identified. He was now stabbing it. The silence stretched for 7 seconds. 8. 9. Verstanden. Understood. The voice was tight. All business. The suspicion was gone, replaced by the cold dread of a man whose worst fears had just been confirmed. Die route is famine. The route is mine. Eddie let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He bought it. Klaus's next words were exactly what Eddie expected. Be no bit a new route, please. Now the kill. Eddie picked up his notebook, his hand steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, terrible focus. He read the fake coordinates, the ones that led to the field of Teller mines. No route is passin' 5. Follow grid 88 Fear. And then the master stroked route is Pioneer Zier. The route is confirmed clean by engineers. He had given Clauser the one thing he craved more than victory. Permission to feel safe. There was a pause as Clauser presumably copied the coordinates. Then one last question. What is the new target? Eddie had prepared for this. He couldn't just send him into an empty field. It had to be a convoy, a lightly defended American supply convoy, an opportunity target. Ender. After taking the target, hold position, await further orders. And the beauty of the lie was its modesty. He wasn't promising Klasse a glorious victory, just a minor, believable, tactical objective, something that wouldn't trigger his suspicion. The reply came back crisp and professional. Klasse was a good soldier. He was a beaten soldier. We're standing route passin'. Understood. Route safe pass. Target supply column. Iron Fist 4. Will execute order. Estimated arrival 05 through 0. End. The static hissed. Eddie released the transmit button. He didn't move. He just sat in the absolute, crushing silence. His entire body began to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor. Adrenaline flooded his system in sickening waves. He'd done it. Klaus had accepted the orders. In approximately 3 hours, 40 German tanks would roll confidently, safely into American minefields, believing they were flanking an ambush. Eddie didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He had just sentenced men to death. Klaus would die. His crews would die. They would die, never knowing they'd been deceived by a corporal in a frozen foxhole. He moved quickly, his hands numb. He buried the German radio deep under the mud and loose dirt in the corner of his foxhole. He buried the notebook with it. He covered the spot, camouflaging it, making it look like it had never been disturbed. His life, his entire future, now depended on no one ever digging in that corner. He sat back, exhausted, and looked at his watch. 22 turned to 24 hours. And that's when a new, colder, worse fear hit him. Klaus's real commanders, the real Panzer Group Commando, were scheduled to make their real call at 02:30 hours in 6 minutes. What would happen when they called and Klaus didn't answer? Or worse, what if Klauser did answer and told them he couldn't, because he was already executing other orders? Eddie realized the deception wasn't over. It had just entered a new terrifying phase. He wasn't just hiding from his own army. He was now hiding from the German one. Eddie sat in the dark. His watch read 02:25 hours. In 5 minutes, the real Panzergruppe Commando would try to contact Klauser. He was now completely, terrifyingly blind. The German radio was buried under 2 FT of frozen mud. He couldn't listen. He couldn't transmit. He couldn't do anything but sit and wait and wonder if his entire deception was about to collapse. He pictured the scene. Somewhere miles away in a German command post, a radio operator was getting ready. He was checking his frequencies. He was looking at his own watch. Eddie's deception rested on one simple, terrifying hope: that the Germans would assume radio failure, not a ghost. At 02:30 hours exactly on schedule, the German operator keyed his transmitter. Eisen Faust Fear here. Commando Mez, Iron Fist 4. This is command. Report in. Silence. Nothing but the hiss of the cold night. The operator tried again, his voice a little louder, a little more annoyed. Eisenfu Fear. Commando, Iron Fist 4. Command, confirm. Silence. The operator turned to his superior, a major who was hunched over a map. Sir, Iron Fist 4 is not responding. The major didn't look up. He's probably just having trouble with the equipment. This cold, it's hell on the batteries. Try the alternate frequency. The operator switched frequencies. He called again and again. Now, the major looked up, his brow furrowed. This wasn't like Klauser. Klauser was a professional. He always responded. Is it jamming? The major asked. No, sir, the operator replied. The frequency is clear. He's just not there. A cold dread began to seep into the German command post. Had Klauser been ambushed before the attack? Had the Americans launched a surprise assault? But the lines were quiet. They tried for 30 minutes. They called his call sign over and over, their transmissions growing more and more desperate. But they were calling into a void. Klauser wasn't answering because Klauser was in radio silence. He was a good soldier, executing what he believed were legitimate orders, driving his 40 tanks through the snow toward a safe pass and an easy target. He would never know his own command was screaming for him. Finally, the German major slammed his fist on the table. He's gone. Either captured or his radio is destroyed. We have to assume the attack on the fuel depot is a failure. The German command, completely blind, scrambled to readjust their plans, never knowing that their own battalion was at that very moment still rolling toward its doom, led there by a voice that had already vanished. Eddie Voss knew none of this. He sat in his foxhole shaking as 3 hours, the 3 longest hours of his life, crawled by. He was in an agony of uncertainty. Did the deception work? Did Clauser turn back? Did the real command reach him? Did the battery die mid-call? Had he doomed 300 Americans and Klaus's battalion for nothing? He stared into the darkness in the direction of the safe pass. The time was 0532 hours. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling, a low-frequency thump that he felt in his chest, a vibration through the frozen earth. Then the sound, a deep, ripping boom that echoed across the hills. A flash of orange light on the horizon. Northeast, exactly where he had sent them. A second explosion, a third, then a fourth, fifth, and sixth. A cascading chain of detonations. Fountains of orange and white fire as 40 tons of German steel, fuel, and ammunition began to tear themselves apart. 2 miles west, the 300 American soldiers at the fuel depot were thrown from their sleep. They grabbed their rifles. They manned their positions. They stared into the darkness, waiting for the panzers that Eddie had heard on the radio. They prepared for an assault that never came. The explosions rolled across the Ardennes for 20 minutes. Secondary detonations, ammunition cooking off, a funeral pea for an entire battalion. Eddie sat in his foxhole and listened to the echoes die. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel pride. He felt the crushing absolute weight of what he had done. He pictured Klaus's final moment. The smoker's rasp. Silenced forever. Klause died instantly. His command tank triggered a teller mine that punched through the thin belly armor and ignited the fuel tanks in a fraction of a second. He never knew he'd been deceived. He never knew the orders came from an American foxhole. In his final fiery moment, Klause believed he was executing a legitimate tactical maneuver to avoid a trap that didn't exist. 23 other German tank crew members died in those first 30 seconds. More would die in the hours that followed as American artillery, alerted by the massive, unexplained explosions, began to rain fire on the trapped burning column. By dawn, the Eisenfußwehr battalion had been effectively destroyed, annihilated, not by superior American tactics, not by overwhelming firepower, but by a single unauthorized voice that had turned a man's trauma into a weapon. At first light, American reconnaissance patrols were sent to investigate the unauthorized engagement. What they found was a graveyard. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant, radioed back to headquarters, his voice shaking. "Sir, I'm at the coordinates. The tanks, they're here. The entire column, it's gone. Wiped out." There was a pause. "But sir, there's nothing here. No American positions, no anti-tank guns, no bodies. They're just in the minefield. They just drove straight in. As if they were ordered to." The intelligence reports that followed were confused, contradictory, and bordered on hysteria. How had a full panzer battalion commanded by a veteran driven directly into a known American minefield? A minefield that wasn't even defending anything. Some analysts suggested a radio malfunction. Others proposed the German commander had suffered a complete mental breakdown. One report even suggested a mass-coordinated suicide. The true explanation was impossible. It never appeared in any official document. The United States Army simply could not explain what had happened. 3 hours after dawn, Eddie was in his foxhole cleaning his rifle, his movements stiff, his mind numb. He was just a corporal again. He heard the crunch of boots in the snow. He looked up. It was Captain Morrison. He wasn't carrying a sidearm. He wasn't flanked by MPs. He was alone. He was holding a single small typed piece of paper. The tag from the CI tent. Morrison climbed down into the foxhole and sat across from Eddie, the silence stretching between them. Finally, the captain spoke. His voice was low. Intelligence found something interesting. This morning, Corporal Eddie met his gaze. He said nothing. A German panzer column completely destroyed in the minefield northeast of here. Exactly where your notes said that minefield was. Morrison paused, his eyes locked on Eddie's. But they weren't supposed to be there, were they? They were supposed to be 2 mi west, attacking the fuel depot. Eddie's face was a mask of cold exhaustion. The German radio we confiscated, Morrison continued, his voice barely a whisper. It's missing from the CI tent, disappeared around Oro 1:30 hours. The guard, he didn't see a thing. The notebook was taken too. A long, agonizing pause. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Corporal? Eddie looked at his captain. No, sir. Morrison stared at him, searching his face. He saw no fear, no pride, just the hollowed-out look of a man who had seen too much. Morrison knew. Eddie knew that he knew. And in that moment, Eddie realized the captain was trapped. He couldn't court-martial the man who had just saved 300 lives, maybe more. But he couldn't ever admit what had happened. To admit that a corporal was right and that command was wrong. To admit that a single soldier had broken every rule and succeeded. It would shatter the very system Morrison had sworn to uphold. Morrison looked down at the small paper tag in his glove. What you did, if you did it, was completely unauthorized. It was the most reckless, insubordinate act I have ever witnessed. You impersonated enemy command. If the Germans had detected you, you'd be dead. This entire position would be a crater. That's not heroism, Voss. That's a catastrophe. That just happened to work. Yes, sir, Eddie said. But Morrison sighed, the anger draining out of him, replaced by something else. Intelligence is calling it the most successful psychological operation of the Battle of the Bulge. They are very confused as to who to give the credit to. Morrison looked at the tag. Unauthorized intelligence source, CPL Voss E. He slowly, deliberately, tore the small paper tag in half, then in quarters. He let the pieces fall into the snow. I am writing a report, Morrison said, standing up. It will state that the German column was likely deceived by a classified, high-level Allied broadcast operation. Source unknown. I am recommending you for a commendation for your initial, courageous intelligence gathering. He paused, brushing snow from his uniform. I am also transferring you effective, immediately a signals unit in Luxembourg. You will be far from the front lines. You will never go near enemy radio equipment again. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Eddie said. Morrison climbed out of the foxhole. He stopped and turned back one last time. Voss, those 300 men who woke up alive this morning, they will never know your name. There won't be any medals for this. No parades. This what really happened will never appear in any official history. It cannot. He looked hard at Eddie. Can you live with that? Eddie thought about Klausa. He thought about the smoker's rasp he would never hear again. Clear's throat. He thought about the men who died believing a lie. I can live with it, sir. Morrison nodded once. Good, because no one else will ever know. He turned and disappeared into the morning light. Eddie Voss spent the rest of the war in Luxembourg, maintaining communication equipment and training new radio operators. He never told a soul what happened in that Belgian foxhole. After the war, he returned to Milwaukee. He married. He raised 3 children. He went back to work for the power company. The man with the golden ear who could hear problems in transformers. He died in 1987 at the age of 64. His family, his friends, his co-workers, they all believed he was just a simple radio repairman who had done his duty. But the story didn't die. It was just scattered. In 1992, a German military historian was interviewing survivors of the Ardennes offensive. He spoke to an old Wehrmacht officer, a former major who had been haunted for nearly 50 years by the ghost of Eisen. The major told the historian, "He just vanished. We tried to call. He was gone. We assumed an ambush. We assumed radio failure. But the Americans, they never attacked the fuel depot. It was quiet. It never made sense." He told him the strangest part. When the wreckage was finally analyzed, the Germans discovered the battalion had been destroyed in a minefield 3 kilometers off their assigned route. The old major said it was as if they were led there by a ghost, by a voice that came from nowhere and sent them all to hell. The historian, intrigued, began digging through declassified American reports. He found Captain Morrison's after-action report. German column destroyed, likely deceived by unknown SCOP broadcast. He found a small combination for a Corporal Eddie Voss for superior intelligence gathering that had saved American lives. But the historian could never find the link. The file on Voss's unauthorized activity, the missing radio, the stolen notebook, it was gone, buried, sanitized, just as Morrison had promised. The truth remained broken in a dozen different files in 2 different languages, hidden, in a frozen foxhole, in a voice that spoke perfect German into the static. Eddie Voss never fired a shot in combat, but on one frozen December night, he fought the most important battle of his life. He was armed with nothing but a captured radio, 4 days of observation, and the courage to become the enemy long enough to save his friends. In the end, war isn't always won by those who follow orders. Sometimes it's won by those who understand when to break them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of World War II's invisible heroes, because sometimes the most important battles are the ones that were never supposed to be recorded.